Mr. and Mrs. Wright. Mr. and Mrs. Wright woke up early on the day before Christmas. Mrs. Wright planned to bake some cookies for Santa's visit. She told Mr. Wright, "I want to have just the right cookie for Santa when he comes tonight." She looked in the pantry and discovered that she had no sugar left. "Mr. Wright," Mrs. Wright cried, "I have no sugar left in the pantry. I need some to bake just the right cookie for Santa. Will you go to the store and get some for me?" Mr. Wright said, "You're right, I'll go right now," and he left immediately. Mrs. Wright began to prepare her cookie batter. When she reached for the sack of flour, she saw there was only a little flour left, not nearly enough to make her cookies. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Wright, "Mr. Wright just left for the store. He will not like to have to go back again." Mrs. Wright quickly left her baking and called the grocer. "This is Mrs. Wright. My husband, Mr. Wright, just left to get some sugar at your store. I just discovered I don't have enough flour left for my cookie. Will you tell him to buy some flour too?" "Oh, Mrs. Wright," the grocer said, "Mr. Wright just left with your sugar. In fact, he bought the only sack left we had on the shelf. I'll try to catch him right quick so he can bring your flour too. We have plenty of that left." Just then, Mr. Wright drove up with a sack of sugar. "Here, Mrs. Wright, this is the only sack they had left." "Oh, Mr. Wright," Mrs. Wright cried, "I don't have enough flour left to bake Santa's cookies. I tried to catch you at the grocer's, but you had already left." "Oh, no," said Mr. Wright. "I'll go right back," and he left immediately. Mrs. Wright turned right around and went back into her kitchen. Suddenly, she realized she had not bought any butter for the cookies either. "Oh my," she exclaimed, "how can I bake the right cookie for Santa without butter?" She called the grocer again and asked him to tell Mr. Wright to bring butter too. Fortunately, Mr. Wright had not left the store yet. When he returned home, Mrs. Wright said, "Bring in the flour and butter right away so I can bake Santa's cookies." Mr. Wright began carrying lots of bags into the kitchen. "All right, what's all this?" said Mrs. Wright. "Well," said Mr. Wright, "I didn't want to have to go back to the store again, so besides your flour and butter, I bought all the cookies the grocer had left. That way, Santa is sure to have the right cookie." The end.